Okay, welcome back. This is part two now as we explore what is contemporary children's culture as we're giving our midterm review here for Humanities 41-42, winter 2017. All right, so when we left off, we talked about, is it real? How is it constructed? Where is it situated? Let's continue on then, just talking about this idea, this construction of contemporary children's culture. Because anytime, I guess the question we're going to ask is, what is its social role? So anytime we have a social construct, or we have social variables, and youth and children, age is a social variable, and youth is a construct, and childhood is a construct. So anytime we're dealing with social constructs or social variables, we're talking about power relations. And the thing with power relations, as we already know in this course, because we've talked about it before, is that power is never shared equally, right? In all power relations, there is an unequal balance of power. And by balance of power, we just mean that, there is more access to the decision-making processes for some than there are for others in all relationships. And all relationships are fundamentally about power. So we're talking about power relations here. And therefore, the social role is about how these power relations get organized. So how are they organized? How are they structured in such a way to allow some access and deny others? So the construct of childhood, as we've talked about in this program since day one, is designed in such a way to deny children access to the decision-making process when those decisions directly affect their own lives. We know this because ideologies such as the myth of childhood innocence, or the idea that children are innocent and naive and in need of protection, at the same time is another competing discourse that children are evil and dangerous and we need protection from them. These two competing discourse both work to set up a construct, a social construct of childhood that denies young people access to the decision-making process when those decisions directly affect their own lives. And as we learned from the Mansell article, what we need when we have two competing discourse is a rights-based approach that comes directly through the middle. And that rights-based approach looks at the real lives of children and separates the construct of childhood from the lives of children themselves. So the social role of contemporary children's culture, I guess, is twofold. In one, it's the construct of childhood is there to deny children access to power or decision-making processes. And at the same time, our desire to explore contemporary children's culture is to illuminate these unequal power relations, to bring them forward, and then to recognize that children's lives are actually separate or different, and then to call that out into public so that way we can, in many ways, work as allies for young people to allow them opportunities for agency and activism and social justice. And that's where we'll go in the next part of this course when we get to Paulo Freire, and that's kind of what's going on in Little Brother as well. But who benefits from contemporary children's culture? Well, of course, here we reach the core of any humanities course, right? Or any communications course, or child and youth studies course, or history course, or cultural studies course, or any discipline that examines human life and human behavior. And that's because who benefits, right, is all about representation. It's all about ideologies and institutions and constructs, and how about there's always unequal power relations. And what that means then is that whether deliberately or not, whether on purpose or not, some always benefit from these representations, from these social organizations or structures, and others are always marginalized and denied access to these decision-making processes. So we can explore these intersections between the representations and the reality, especially when it comes to youth and especially when it comes to childhood and children's lives. And we can explore them and unpack them. So the question of who benefits are the questions that we need to be asking, because we need to pull to the forefront, why are these the ideological constructs of youth and childhood? Why are these the organizational structures of childhood and youth? But to do that, I think what we need to do is we need to look at media, because we've already talked about how media is a very important part of young people's lives. We've talked about how media is, excuse me, an important part of contemporary children's culture. But why? Well, media is important because media is the central storyteller. Right? It is the key storyteller in 21st century North American life, which is where we are right now. And we've already said that contemporary children's culture is time and space dependent. And so it's important that we look at where we are right now. In 21st century North America, media is the dominant storyteller. It has massive reach, it has massive power, it has massive impact, but it also has massive potential for young people. If you read Little Brother, which you did, then you've seen some of that, what that potential can be in used differently or in an alternate fashion. And when we get to Paulo Freire, we'll be able to borrow more on those ideas. But what is media? And this is an important thing again. And by definition, media is just the plural of the word medium, which means like to transfer, basically, something through which we transfer. So we're talking about objects of technology that relate stories, that relate words or pictures or images or ideas from one to another through a medium. But it's a busy word and it's a confusing word and it's often used in many different ways, and we've talked about this in this course. So then how does media itself work? Well, there are several different theories for how media works, we could look at it from a variety of perspectives. One way that we could look at it would be through what's called the hypodermic needle model, and that would suggest that media messages start at the top. We see that sunlight so bright, making it difficult for us here. There we go. Media messages start at the top and they make their way down to the bottom, just like a needle, right? Shooting it from the top to the bottom, a hypodermic needle model. And that, that suggests that, again, messages are made up here and they're sent down and we just all take what comes to us. Or there could be something maybe a little more like we've talked about in the class that has a bit of a feedback loop going on where ideas go one way from production to consumption, from production to consumption, production here to consumption, but then from consumption back to production, there's a feedback loop or a feedback channel. But ultimately, it doesn't matter which model we borrow from, because no matter how you view media, okay, whether you see it as good or bad, whether you see it as open or closed, whether you see it as brainwashing or potentially revolutionary, in all cases, when we explore media, what we have is we have producers, media producers, who encode media messages with meaning, and we have channels and mediums through which those messages travel, and then we have consumers, often called audiences, who decode, either actively or passively, those same media messages. So we have encoding, we have travel through mediums, and we have decoding. Okay, so how do we study then media? Because there's so much going on there. There's so many different parts to it. There's so many different ideas to it. Well, there's a couple of different ways. Douglas Kellner told us that we could look at media as stories, right? They're stories that tell us who can belong and who cannot, and how society is organized and structured, and what roles you can and cannot play. At the same time as we can look at media as spectacle, it's big and it's bold and it's flashy and it's sharp and it's distracting. It's very distracting from real social relations and from real social problems. And so we get caught up in the spectacle of it all, and we don't always see what's actually going on and who is being used and abused in the process to allow this to take place. But we also see it as pedagogy. So media is stories, a spectacle is pedagogy. Pedagogy in that it teaches us how to fit into the society around us. And Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, but I told you early on that the medium is the media, it is the medium, and it is the message as three separate components. And as I just told you 2 seconds ago, media messages get produced, and then the medium travels, and then the media gets decoded as well. So there's media, medium, and message. But whether you want to use either Kellner or McLuhan's different categories of studying media, or just the ones that we've talked about in class, what's important is that Kellner gives us a great structure for unpacking all that, and that is the three-pronged approach of political economy and textual analysis and audience reception. Is to look at ideas where they get produced and where they get made, the economic and political decisions that go into the encoding, to look at the text itself separate from production, separate from consumption, and what's the politics of representation embedded in the text itself. What does it represent? What does it tell us about race and class and gender and age and sexuality and ability and all of these ideas? And then to look at the audience reception, the consumption of the text. How is it taken up? Who takes it up and how do they take it up? And if we're doing that three-pronged approach, and if we're looking at institutional voices for and about and children's own voices, we're going to get a very clear picture of what's happening in contemporary children's culture. So what does this then have to do, I guess, with, what does media then have to do with contemporary children's culture? really, like, and why are we sort of smushing these two things together? Why do we go to the Kellner text? Why do we look at critical media literacy? Why do we look at play or education, policy, advertising, television, cell phones, video games, popular music, right? Why do we go to all of these spaces? Well, this is a great point. It's also the big point. It's the core of the course itself. It's the key ideas that we come back to, right? And I broke it down in a couple of ways here. The first is that children's lives in the 21st century in North America are heavily situated inside a media-dominated culture, right? It's a media-dominated culture. They see media from brand names to iPods to iPads to phones, televisions, movies, and music, etc. at every turn in their life. In fact, this is the most mediated generation of young people to ever exist in the lives of humans. So in all of humankind, this is the most media saturated generation ever, especially in North America and in the West. So that's the first point. So why do we have to study media to understand contemporary children's culture? Well, children's lives in the 21st century in North America are heavily situated inside a media-dominated culture. Second, children's lives in 21st century North America are largely described to them through media. So we have institutional voices about children, and we have children's own voices, but the ways in which those come into contact with each other, the ways in which the social construction of childhood and children's real lives come into contact with each other, because again, we're interested in where they intersect. So how do they come into contact with each other? In both directions, that happens through media. So children are described, the world is described to them through media, popular culture, and children speak back to that through popular culture in both ways. Through play, through subversion, like subversive play, all right? And of course we see this completely in Barbies and in, in speaking back to advertisements, in World of Warcraft types of games and game playing, in popular music. This is the importance of critical media literacy, to decode that, to be able to code yourself and speak back to it. This is at the core of Little Brother. These are all the ideas as they come together. Children's lives in the 21st century, this is the second point, are largely described to them through media, institutional voices for children. They largely speak back to these, through media, children's own voices. And so the constructs of childhood, or what it means to be a child, are always being dictated to children through popular culture, and children are always speaking back to them through media devices and media use, play, subversive play as well. So media is very important to contemporary children's culture because it's that overlapping, it's that where that moment happens. Media is what's coming from both directions. And of course, this is then the third point and the most important point, and I guess the final point, and that is, it is the space, media is the space through which children negotiate their identities, their social roles, and their social power, or access to social power, in the 21st century in North America. So that is why you cannot study contemporary children's culture, contemporary children's culture in 2017 in Toronto, in the GTA, in Canada, and North America without a discussion of media. Because children live in a heavily media-dominated culture, so situated inside a heavily media-dominated culture. Their lives are largely dictated to them through media and popular culture. They speak back to, or make sense of, negotiate, understand, unpack themselves and their sense of self, their identities, their social roles, and their social power through media as well. So media is the crux. It's the key to understanding contemporary children's culture. And so that is why in this first module, we looked at all of those different ways or spaces, media spaces, where children interact with society around them, right? So if media is the space, what do these spaces look like? We know they need critical media literacy to decode these spaces. Luke tells us that, Scher tells us that, Kellner tells us that, but what are the spaces? Well, the spaces are play. Play is so important because play is the actual rituals. It's the actual actions. It's the participation component where young people engage with the media. They do it through play. And that could be texting, and that could be social media sites like Zoller says. That could be toys, like Barbie, for example, that we dealt with Steinberg. That could be game playing, whether it be online, like World of Warcraft game playing, or whether it be outdoor play. We talked about a little bit in class some of the ways that the play is similar and different from online to virtual spaces. But play is the rituals, the practices. That's where the action from the ideologies goes to through the actions becomes the reality that happens through play. And that's why play is so important to this whole discussion, but play in and through media spaces. That's why education plays a role and policy plays a role. And whether we talk about Mansell or we talk about Luke and Scher, because inside those institutions, we have to continue to find spaces for children to engage and for children to play inside those spaces. Remember, all of children's lives exist inside adult-dominated spaces. So if these institutions of education and government, etc., are always going to be there, then we also need to find and sometimes even forcefully create spaces where children can play inside of there to make sense of it by using the media. And that's why we talk about television, because that's a core part of their lives. We talk about advertising because they engage with not just Barbie, but McDonald's and Spider-Man and flow and transmedia intertextuality and convergence and synergy, and all of this is happening, and it's happening in a way that is going on up here, but also as Jali says, so Jali tells us, it's not just about convergence and transmedia intertextuality, it's also about what that tells young people about gender and sexuality and age and ability, and who belongs and who doesn't. And we see that in reality TV as well, of what the representation of the middle class, in cell phones and in video games and in popular music. And that's why, in order to explore contemporary children's culture in the 21st century, we have to look at media, because it is the crux. It is where it all happens. It's where it all takes place. It is the centerpiece of contemporary children's culture. And that's why texts like Little Brother is so essential, because it shows us both the limiting aspects of media for contemporary children's culture when it's used for oppression or suppression or the denial of voice by institutions like government and education, but it also shows us the opportunities, the revolutionary possibilities of media for young people, when it shows us that activism is possible, that agency is possible, that communication in third spaces is possible for young people, and what that can mean, the liberating potential for that, not just for young people themselves, but for democracy as a whole. And that's the topic of Paulo Freire, and that's where we go to after the break. Have a great reading week, everyone. Good luck on your essays. Feedback is coming to those who sent in their reports and their paragraphs, and I will see you all after the break.